sometimes life will find a way.
No, I'm simply saying that life finds a way.
Famous words from the best movie of all time, Jurassic Park. And if life can find a way, I take that as nature can find a way. Same thing, right? A lot of the times, the problem that you might be having with your aquarium is something that nature can sort out if you just give it enough time. That can be kind of difficult because depending on the problem, you might not want to look at it for a super long time. Case in point, the issues that I've been dealing with in this tank. And I got to the point where I really thought nature did me a solid by being patient. What ended up happening is that nature and patience ended up trading one issue for another issue. And so I still needed to intervene in the aquarium. Sometimes nature doesn't do everything that you want it to. I just did a ton of work to this tank today. It looks a million times better, but we need to talk about the story of what's been going on with this aquarium. I have a little bit more work to do, but I think this is really going to kind of put things into perspective. And if you're dealing with an issue in your tank, even if it's not the exact same issue that I'm dealing with, I think you're going to be able to gain some good information here and hopefully help solve some of your problems. Before we start talking the specifics on what happened to this tank, my theories behind it, I want to clean the tank up. So got to go through here. All this Pinnatophyta in the front that's super leggy. I mean, it kind of looks cool, but it's throwing off the vibe of the tank. Now that the algae problem has kind of resolved itself, I want to be able to see my trees a little bit better. And I'm excited that the Monte Carlo has actually rebounded. So we want to probably get in there and trim that up in a little bit. We still have a little bit of this algae on the Monte Carlo, but it should hopefully trim off pretty easily. There's also a ton of this whatever it looks kind of like dwarf sage, almost like a mix of between some type of val. I can't remember what species it is, but that's how it behaves. It's a runner. It's all over the front of the tank. It's all over pretty much the entire tank itself. So we want to try and delicately pull that stuff out. Just in case you don't remember, we have only sand in here. There is no aqua soil or potting soil or anything, but it's so old and so seasoned that it's full of detritus, mulm, and all that stuff. So it's going to if we pull a plant out with its roots and we aren't careful about doing that, it's going to send up a bunch of stuff into the water column, and we want to try and avoid that. Once I've removed a decent amount of plants, now we can kind of step back and assess the tank a little bit more, see what else we want to do without getting too crazy. There's a bunch of random cyano in here, and there's a bunch of junk that's still down in the hair grass. It's managed to grow through it though, which is really cool. Same kind of goes for the Monte Carlo. We do need to trim this. I don't want to go down and start trimming any of the hair grass because I don't think we need to, but I want to try and clean it up. We just bust out the straight pipe siphon and we start sucking stuff out of the tank. We want to try and get as much of that junk out as possible because it just doesn't need to be there anymore. Quick side note, has anybody ever taken their python up on top of their roof to unspiral kinkify the tube thing? I'm about to have to do that. Same goes for the cyanobacteria. That stuff's a plague. I'm kind of surprised to see it, but also at the same time, not really. We'll talk about the dynamics of this tank and what I think has gone through on this thing to put it in the position that it is in today. But that is something that is just super unsightly. It doesn't necessarily hurt the environment. It doesn't hurt the fish. I don't think it's excreting any kind of harmful chemicals. All the fish are fine. That's not something that we typically see in aquarium algae, not the wild where you have certain cyanobacterias or algae that produce harmful chemicals. More of just an unsightly thing that we want to clean up and get rid of. I also have to figure out what I'm going to do with these potato roots because as you'll notice, they are covered with this one particular type of algae. Doesn't look very good. This might be a big rip for the potato. I think I'm going to have to cut this whole root system off. That might just totally cook this thing, but it's covered in cyano. I don't know. We just got to do it. I mean, these roots are wild. They were everywhere. This tree back here, I feel so bad for this tree back here that you can't really see. It's totally covered. All the roots were just growing into it. It might be totally cooked too, but yeah, I don't know. At this point, we just finish off with a little bit more of a water change, fill her back up, clean all our filters, and do all of that stuff just to get everything kind of reset back to normal. Now let's transition into talking about kind of what happened to this tank and how we just got lazy and let nature do its thing, and it turned out to work very well and for our benefit. Ay. This is going to be a multi-day event. Before we dive into the final thing that I want to do to this tank, to give it the treatment that I think it deserves, it's really going to solve the current issue that we have, we got to go back and we got to talk about the last time that we really talked about this tank in detail. It was a video where we let nature control the tank for 4 months. So I basically ignored this aquarium for 4 months all summer long last summer. I was busy with rice fish stuff, you know how it is, but what happened was everything was fine. Like, the tank got super overgrown, plants were doing good, the CO2 was turned off. I kind of just let it chill and do its thing for that whole entire period of time. And in that video, we basically kind of did what we did in this video. We went through, we took a bunch of plants out, we cleaned things up, we got the aquascape back in check. We did have a little bit of an annoying algae, not the stuff that we've been dealing with in this video per se, but it was a super annoying green fuzz algae that was primarily growing on the Monte Carlo. It was tightly affixed, so the only way to physically remove it was to trim, and that wasn't the best way of physical removal. It was just the only way. So I did my best. We kind of wrapped things up with a different chemical treatment specifically for that algae to try and get rid of it. And when it was all said and done, the tank looked pretty dang good. My only mistake was that I think I kind of tweaked the lights a little bit, or at least the ONF light that's on here. The app is kind of wonky, and the thing was running at 100% for a very long time. I didn't even notice. It's surprisingly easy to do stuff like that, especially when technology doesn't work the way you want it to and you trust it too much. But the result was just a not very good one. So that algae continued to grow. I didn't want to keep tweaking things. I just kind of said like, hey, let's roll with this and see what happens, because at this point, there's no amount of trimming or physical work that I can do to really fix the tank. So let's see if nature can do it on its own. The theory was that if I can just stand having a really ugly aquarium for a long enough period of time, whatever that algae is taking advantage of in the environment, it will eventually deplete itself, and then that algae will slowly stop growing and hopefully eventually just die back. There was nothing in the water column of this aquarium, and there never really ever has been, that would indicate like, hey, this is probably a source of this algae's growth. We're talking about things like nitrate, like phosphate. Those are really the only two that we can actually test for. They're zero across the board. Maybe there's a little bit of phosphate, just depends on how efficiently the plants are using the CO2. The whole point of what this video was going to be was that like, water changes aren't going to save you. No amount of water changes can solve a problem for you, especially if you're worried about things that you're supposed to be able to detect in the water column. If they're not there, then it's like, what is the fuel for the fire? What ended up happening a few months ago was that algae finally hit a brick wall. I don't know what ran out in the tank. Again, no detectable nitrogen, no detectable phosphorus. It just sort of gradually burned itself out, and I was super stoked on that. There wasn't any cyanobacteria in the tank at the time, so I was getting really excited that my idea for the video was going to come true. And then the cyano came in and ruined everything, and that's why we're here today. The running theory I have is that there was just simply an overload of organic compounds in the tank that were being broken down, turning into things like nitrogen and phosphorus, and then being quickly consumed by the algae, which for whatever reason, somehow, some way, was outcompeting the plants for those things. When that algae began to run out of fuel and its dominance in the tank slowed down, that's when the cyanobacteria came about. So something else that wasn't our plants then stepped into place, started taking advantage of those things again in the tank as the algae's dying off and being recycled into the system. And I think we just sort of got a little unlucky in that department. Not a crazy weird phenomenon. I mean, these things happen all the time in real nature outside of our aquariums, but that's the running theory that I have. It's a pretty simple one. It makes sense. Nothing crazy has been going on in the tank. I haven't been dumping a ton of food into this aquarium. I don't think I've been the source of any sort of excess nutrients. Again, we still, even to this day, can't detect anything in the water column. But now hopefully with, again, the changes that we made, those changes won't overwhelm the system. Things will be able to kind of rebalance themselves. The plants will now, again, have a chance to be the dominant thing in the tank that's pulling out nutrients, even, those nutrients that are coming from some dissolved organic carbon. We removed a lot of the physical carbon and nutrients that were locked down, those were kind of in a layer building up over on top of the algae, all the fish waste, all the mold, broken down plants. I think this was the reset that we needed. And I really do think that if we just would have left the tank for another 4 or 5 months, I think we'd still be in roughly the same situation. Maybe it would have gone full circle, the cyano would have died off, and then that same algae that's kind of still on some of the Monte Carlo would have came back. All of this could still happen too, is, the unpredictability of this whole situation, but I think we're in a much better situation now after the intervention that we've done and that we're going to continue to do here in just a second. I feel like we did a pretty good job of physical removal. We didn't trim the Monte Carlo yet. Doing a trim on the Monte Carlo to get rid of the cyanobacteria might be a good way to do it. We do need to trim anyway, probably a little bit, but it's so slippery and annoying. I just kind of don't want to do it. I think we're better off at this point doing a treatment for it. It's going to help to melt a bunch of it away, basically disintegrate it. And in like 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, we can kind of reassess the situation and then go from there. So I think that's what I'm going to do. You have a couple different routes to go if you want to treat and kill cyanobacteria. The first place that you can go is antibiotic world, because this is a bacteria, not a true algae. Try and give you the quick and dirty version with all the antibiotic stuff, but you have the main antibiotic that's used for a lot of different fish diseases. It's erythromycin. So you're going to have products like fitzmaricin that is just erythromycin. And then I'm pretty sure like every other fish chemical company makes the same thing. They all use erythromycin. This is a type of antibiotic that doesn't impact gram-negative bacteria very much. So your nitrifying bacteria, most of the good bacteria that you want, the non-pathogens, are going to be in probably more so skewed towards being gram-negative. That's not 100% the case at all, but it's just that most of the common pathogens that fish get are gram-positive. Unless it's at really high concentrations, it's not going to destructively kill a bunch of bacteria. It's essentially just going to slow down the reproduction of the bacteria. So if you think in the context of a pathogen, that's good because it stops the bad thing from growing, gives the organism's immune system time to fight back. But that's not really what we're doing here at all. And on top of that, our cyanobacteria are most likely, probably, I think 100% a gram-negative bacteria. So the fitzmaricin or just erythromycin generic wouldn't really do much. So what you need to do is find an antibiotic that affects gram-negative bacteria. The problem with that is that your good bacteria, specifically your nitrifiers, are also gram-negative. So I know what you're thinking. The antibiotic route sounds like the worst route that you could go, but it's not like everything's 100%. You can totally use all of these antibiotics for whatever reason you need them for and not have it like totally screw up your environment. But it is something that can happen if you're using high doses, probably more than whatever company recommends, and if you're doing it for super long periods of time. That's definitely not going to be something good for your tank, probably in either case. When it comes to saving a fish's life, that's kind of like the most important thing. I think that takes precedence over the environment a little bit, right? Like if you're going to be killing a bunch of bacteria, yeah, it's not good, but if you're in turn able to save a fish's life, I mean, your environment is going to recuperate at some point, and it's probably not going to be as detrimental as you might think. But lucky for us, there is a very good alternative that involves not having to use antibiotics, and it still works really good at getting rid of cyanobacteria. Instead, we're going to be using this stuff because it rules. This is Ultralife Reef Products Blue-Green Slime Stain Remover. Longest name ever. But this stuff is really like the best thing ever. It's not an antibiotic. I think it works just as good, maybe even better in this type of a situation. It's a magical plant or microbe enzyme. It's kind of a secret. And it just destroys blue-green algae, aka cyanobacteria. And so we're just going to follow the directions. We're going to mix up the appropriate amount into some warm water and then dump that right into the tank. Walking back out to the tank, it has actually been a couple days since we did our cyanobacteria treatment, and some of these spots where I tried to get some before shots for some awesome after shots are not looking super great. Like there's been a little bit of digestion of some of the cyano, like these back trees are really starting to kind of clear up. We're seeing more green, but there definitely is some space here where there's still some cyano. We might have to come in and do another treatment. This stuff that's really dug into some of the parts of the trees is that older algae that I referenced we had really growing in abundance earlier in the year, but I don't know, it's dead, but it's not, because it's not completely gone. I don't know. This is definitely one of those things where we're gonna have to get in here and we're just gonna have to trim it out. Like, it's the only way, I think. Still got some stuff on the glass. I'm not sure if, like, this was the bottle that I showed you in the video, completely white. It's supposed to be pink like this one. This was the fresh bottle and we use this, but both of these are super old and they're definitely like expired, if this stuff even does expire. I don't know. That's kind of the excuse that I'm telling myself for why this didn't work as good as the way I prefaced it. But I mean, in the past, like when I've used this stuff and had really good success with it, it's all on relatively fresh cyano that hasn't had a chance to really form a bunch of layers. As a lot of these microbes that live in communities like this, as they get older and as they mature, they form these thick layers, and then they tend to be a little bit more resistant to whatever treatment that you might be putting on it. That's not like a 100% thing, but it's kind of a common trend. So I don't know, maybe this cyano is a little bit of a mutant strain, or it's just, yeah, I've been watching too much Fallout, can you tell? All in all, I think what we did is going to give the plants another fresh chance to really take over and be the big drivers of all the nutrient consumption in this tank. And hopefully after a little bit more physical removal just over the next few days, then we can resolve this thing completely, more or less completely, and get this tank back on the right track. Here's another example of nature coming in the clutch and doing me a solid, embracing it a little bit, but then also it kind of doing me dirty. So remember over here in the rice fish tanks, the guppy tanks, we decided to embrace it and let this algae just grow, this green stringy stuff. It's completely taken over a bunch of our tubs and a lot of our tanks, and that was good. It was cool. Like, it doesn't look terrible. It's kind of choking out the plants for light a little bit in some of these. I actually came in and cleaned it out of this tank and also this tank. You can see there's still quite a bit of nature going on in here. All that detritus, sponge filter completely covered. When I decided to finally pull some of this stuff out, I did it on this rice fish tank, and when the action of me pulling out this huge mass, like doing one of these, right? I accidentally pulled up a bunch of rice fish into that algae, didn't notice them, started squeezing the algae to get ready to throw it in the trash. And a couple of my favorite koi rice fish, even ones with the orange heads, I noticed them, I pulled them out, I put them back in the tank. They were a little shocked. I didn't physically actually squeeze them, I don't think. But a few of them ended up not surviving. So again, 100% my fault, not nature's fault really, other than the fact that the algae was growing like crazy, which is what I wanted it to do, but just sort of the double-edged sword. Totally a specific example that you're probably never gonna have to deal with, but wanted to throw that out there. Aquarium stuff, man. It's never a dull day over here. So that's the story of how nature kind of did me a solid, but then it also did me in a way that I didn't want to be done. I think the moral of the story is that sometimes just being patient and letting your tank figure itself out can definitely be something that works for you, but sometimes it's also just going to keep cycling through different types of problems. And it's just what nature wants to do. Something that can live here wants to live here. Like, the rent is cheap. A lot of things can afford to live here. And so that's always going to be that battle that you face is, how do I set up a tank that doesn't lend itself to those issues? I know you might be saying like, well, if you would have set the tank up better, then you wouldn't have had those problems. Or if your lighting was lower, if you weren't using so much CO2, or if you were using more CO2, if the substrate was different, if the plant selection was different, if there was more plants. I mean, these are all things that, yes, could have helped, but I don't think they necessarily could have prevented the situation altogether. So that is the mysterious world of aquariums, or at least how I see it. All you can do is your best. All you can do is try and learn from little mistakes that you make. And as you go through your journey, you find out the things that work and the things that don't work, and stick with the things that do work for you and for your tanks. Anyway, guys, it is another sunny day. They're few and far between. I gotta go not do some rice fish stuff, I promise. But yeah, thanks for hanging out with me today, and I hope you learned something. Maybe you learned something about antibiotics randomly that you are glad you know now. I don't know. But yeah, I'm gonna hit it, and we'll see you next weekend.